Hello, welcome to our presentation on spelling and grammar checkers. My name is Michelle Miller and I created this presentation with Miranda Keuhmichel. Before we get started, I'd like to read you the first two stanzas of the poem Candidate for a Pulitzer Prize by Mark Ekman and Gerald H. Czar. I have a spelling checker. It came with my new PC. It plainly marks for my review mistakes I cannot see. I ran this poem through it. You're sure real glad to know. It's very polished in its way, my checker told me so. As you can see, this poem is filled with homophones, a common error that spell checkers miss, which Ekman and Czar play with in this piece. Generally speaking, people believe that poor spelling, especially mixed-up homophones on a digital document, is indicative of poor intelligence on the author's behalf. One 2005 study suggested that this disposition can really damage a writer's credibility if there are spelling errors, particularly homophones, in their document. Our survey of 30 people suggested some disagreement, but since we surveyed both people from our technical editing class and the Boise State Writing Center, our data may be skewed towards the opposite way of thinking, since Writing Center training looks at how spelling is a lower level concern in terms of writing skill. Overall, though, we see some variance in opinion. In our research, we looked at the potential pros and cons of spell check software. From the website Jobs for Editors, the following list sums them up fairly well. The pros are, it's automatic, it's helpful for dyslexic people, it marks words that are used too often, the software itself is mostly free. This can also benefit the learning process, it increases the accuracy of spelling, it saves a ton of time, and it includes the find and replace function, allowing for spelling errors to be changed throughout the document in seconds. The cons are as follows. It only shows common errors. It can create complacency in writers. It might find problems that don't exist, for example, if you're writing in a different vernacular of English. You have to be good at spelling to use them effectively. It can be dangerous for the inattentive since it can occasionally suggest errors. It misses homonyms, and it mixes up compound words. Now that we've looked at general attitudes towards spelling and the perceived pros and cons of spell check software, let's jump into the history of their development. Spelling and grammar checkers were first introduced in the 1970s in Writer's Workbench, and in the 80s, Microsoft and WordPerfect implemented checking modules. Since sentence structure varies so much, grammar checkers were fairly limited, only really able to skim over a few words to check for subject-verb agreement. As these softwares develop, we begin to see more widespread usage. In the 90s, these checkers began showing up in schools, geared towards student writers. But after the turn of the millennium and the dive into a globalized world, spell check became integrated into Microsoft Word and veered from being geared towards students to international business and English language learners. Throughout their development, these softwares were generally created and influenced by computational linguists. As spell check moved from analyzing chunks of a few words, these linguists began using machine learning, allowing programmers to feed a computer dataset of correct English usage, from which the computer creates an algorithm to work with. Currently, most of these algorithms live in the cloud, so they don't take up space on the hard drive. But what does this mean for the culture surrounding our writing? First, it is important to know that English grammar has literally infinite possibilities when it comes to usage and patterns, and it is constantly in flux, which an algorithm cannot handle. Due to this, these checkers are changing what English grammar looks like, so much so that teachers have had to change how they teach grammar. These programs are being controlled, created, and dictated by computational linguists, who are generally not trained rhetoricians or technical writers, or part of the groups that these softwares are being developed for. Let's look at a couple of case studies to show how spelling and grammar checkers can be unhelpful. Our first example here is if we run an excerpt of the Declaration of Independence through Microsoft Word. As we can see, there are no suggested changes, but that likely could be due to this piece of writing already being put into the algorithm as a piece of quote-unquote proper English usage. However, this grammar structure is not how we write anymore. If we look at this sentence put through Grammarly, a web-based spelling and grammar checker, we see that this software suggests two changes. The first is changing the word bonds to bands, which in the case of this sentence doesn't make sense, despite Grammarly's insistence otherwise. Grammarly also offers to omit the phrase with one another as well, as it is seen as a redundancy. However, redundancies can be used rhetorically for emphasis. It would be very interesting to see what our Declaration of Independence would look like if the Founding Fathers had a web-based grammar and spelling checking software available to them. The survey we completed and mentioned earlier also offered some interesting perspectives on the use of grammar and spelling checkers. We learned that 84% of our participants used pre-programmed checkers in their word processing software while writing. 40% also used web-based third-party software such as Grammarly. Everyone surveyed found these checkers to be either neutrally helpful or helpful, suggesting that even though most believe that spelling isn't a marker of intelligence, these tools are used widely. We also found that people find grammar to be far less likely an indicator of a writer's intelligence, which is interesting considering grammar checkers aren't as effective as spelling checkers. Of course, we do have to address that our survey represents a small and possibly skewed data set, and in order to best represent the population of users, we'd need to do a much larger study. Since much of our data is inconclusive as to whether or not we should use or not use spelling and grammar checkers, we instead offer you these thoughts and questions to consider as you move forward as writers and editors. First, spelling and grammar checkers are simply a tool, not the last say in your writing. Second, your spelling choices and grammar choices are rhetorical and your own. Third, we have to ask ourselves if we are okay with a small group of software developers telling us what kind of language is correct. We also have to ask how these spelling and grammar checkers are perpetuating standard American English and academic English, both of which are exclusive dialects. Finally, we must ask ourselves how we stay true to ourselves and our clients as technical editors when spelling and grammar checking software creates rules for us. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. We hope you enjoyed it.